India's military is a lot weirder than you might think. From the weapons they have developed, their military culture, and the whatever this is, there is quite a bit that would seem strange when compared to Western armed forces. Before I get started though, I just want to apologize in advance. India edits their official media outputs like it's a TV show, so if you don't like Bollywood style footage, blame them, not me. I'll start this out by saying that India is the second largest military in the world, with 1.45 million in active service, and they have the third largest military budget. And by all accounts, they are a significant regional power. That was my get out of jail free card in case people attack me like they did on the China is weird video. But being formerly British controlled, there are significant influences, from external ones such as marching styles, uniforms, and their rank system, to the fact that English is the official working language for communication across the Indian armed forces. And because of that, there's a lot that many of us would probably be familiar with. On the other hand, there is a bit of clashing of cultures, so to speak. The Indian military, for example, still uses the British regimental system introduced in the early part of the 20th century, where troops are organized into regiments based on the region they came from, their ethnicity or caste. And while the caste system has technically been removed from the Indian government, there are still cultural artifacts of it being there. Not to throw stones at glass houses, because America used to do that, but for less ideal reasons. But in India, it's still incredibly common. The major reason for this is the sheer diversity of the subcontinent. To steal a metaphor from the venerable Puran, visiting an Indian city and then saying you know all about India is like visiting Venice for a week and then saying you know all about Europe. At a day-to-day level, when your ethnic language map looks like this, it starts to make sense that sometimes it's just simpler to create conglomerates of the same kinds of people. Final British control ended in 1947 with the creation of India and Pakistan as two separate states. And then the two countries almost immediately kicked off a massive war against each other with the military gear that the Brits had left behind. The consequences of colonialism. And while nearly 3/4 of a century might seem like a long time to get your military all set up and running all nicely, like other larger militaries that only got their real start in the 20th century, they're gonna have some quirks and features. I think the easiest way to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about is just by looking at their natively produced INSAS rifle. Looking to replace their L1A1s, the Indian military wanted a rifle to call their own, and the task was given over to the Armament Research and Development Establishment. And while in the most literal sense they did in fact make a rifle that was their own, it was one that took the operating system of the AKM, the gas regulator of the FAL, the charging handle of the HK-33, the furniture from the Khalil, and the magazine of an AUG. But yes, technically it was a new rifle. First introduced in 1998 and currently still in active service, it saw its first bit of combat back in 1999 in the Kargil War, and it was considered a spectacular failure, with magazines breaking apart, issues with the gas regulator, and spraying the operator with weapon lubricant while randomly switching to fully automatic for no discernible reason. Which sounds fun if you're the uninitiated, but it's not. These were exported to Bhutan, Nepal, Oman, and Eswatini, aka Swaziland, albeit all of them also hated it and quickly looked to replace it with more conventional Western-style weapons. India themselves had begun the replacement process, swapping out the INSAS rifle for Russian AK-203s, SIG 716s, and Negev light machine guns to cover all the roles the original rifle held. So why did India put so much effort into building 900,000 of these, equipping their entire army for them, exporting them, only to just turn around and just buy a family of unrelated foreign weapon systems? It's not like other countries haven't produced garbage rifles before, but typically these get refined and upgraded instead of just outright replaced. So what went on here? Well, unlike most Western militaries who rely on private enterprises to put out competing bids and figure out which one can come up with the best piece of gear, the Indian military had a full monopoly on the creation process when it came to building the INSAS. And while there are some potential benefits of the army designing and producing its own gear, yeah, none of that was happening here. And things like overly focusing on cost reduction, not involving soldiers at all in the decision-making process, and enough government red tape that would make the American Tax Bureau blush, you land on a rifle that is at best on par with ones designed in the 60s, and at worst, a failure in essentially every single way. That said, if anyone wants to figure out how to import one of these into the United States, I will punt a toddler if it means I get to own one. Quickly though, I will address the inherent bias of having to research this rifle, because nearly all of the English information on this rifle is overarchingly negative, and all the native language information on this is neutral for the most part. Add in the fact that India hasn't engaged in serious full-scale combat that lasted for at least a year in decades, it was fine for a relatively stable period in the Indian defense world, all things considered. But some of the weird confusion behind their rifle extends to the rest of their gear too. Unlike other modern militaries which seem just dead set on making everyone look the exact same no matter whose side you're on, India's military has retained a more unique look, with a large portion of soldiers sporting the Disruptive Pattern Material Camouflage, or DPM, not to be confused with the British DPM, though that would make sense given their history. And you'll still see some troops sporting the older brushstroke style pattern from the 80s as well. In 2022, a new digital pattern uniform was announced, although why they went with this specific mannequin to display it, I have no idea. But personally, I think digital camouflage is for nerds, but I'm sure they had their reason. Probably the most unique piece of Indian gear is this specific helmet called the Patka helmet. And as this picture shows, it gets its unique shape from its construction, which consists of a phantom steel band wrapped in foam which is nested inside of a round cap. These were pretty cheap to produce and offered some actually decent protection against some sizable rounds, given that it is just a solid piece of steel and it's better than the old fiberglass ones they used to run around with. The purpose of this was actually originally to be worn by Sikh members of the armed forces to accommodate a turban, but it was actually generally popular with troops that didn't even fall into that category because it was lightweight and firmly in the good enough category. These and all other helmets are currently being replaced by the MKU Makut Advanced Combat Helmet, which is a lot closer to what we're used to seeing these days. But if you look at pictures of the Indian military online, you'll find that their gear seems to be all over the place in terms of consistency. No one helmet seems to be exactly the same from one unit to the next. Individual loadouts seem to be a bit all over the place, and you'll see more variants of weapon systems from modern battle rifle setups to bullpups, PDWs, MGLs, and World War II leftovers. But why is that, you might ask? Well, the overly simplified answer is that India has a lot of people, a little over 1.4 billion to be exact, and by extension, their military is going to be big as well. Militaries are, you guessed it, expensive, so it's a lot cheaper to keep old rifles around even if they do suck. Or buy a batch of weapons from Israel instead of trying to research and develop your own, or just upgrade the army in a piecemeal fashion rather than doing a massive overhaul that the limited defense industry base in India wouldn't be able to keep up with anyway. Though I would be completely remiss if I did not mention the piece of Indian military gear that is not standard in pretty much any military out there: badass melee weapons. India, on top of having to deal with military corruption, a massive civilian-military divide, and public societal issues such as poor education among the enlisted troops, internal racism, and a culture of officer class that is closer to 19th century Britain than the 2020s, you have this: the shared Indian-Chinese border. China and India have never been the closest of friends, but in 2020, India began building roads into the region. China didn't like that, naturally, and add in the fact that they had been gradually encroaching on Indian territory with things like pillboxes and military fortifications, you have a recipe for a little bit of an international incident. But the weird thing about this border starts with a treaty signed in 1996 called the Line of Actual Control, where they agreed that both sides are not allowed to open fire, hunt with guns, or use explosives within 2 kilometers of the boundary. But neither country wanted to take this sitting down, so both sides decided to just handle things like men and duke it out with fists and rocks, Cain and Abel style. The thing is, though, is that when you have two sides equipped in gear that is more designed to protect against bullets and shrapnel, some fists and rocks won't do much except just cause a few bruises and bloody noses. So this led to both sides developing dedicated melee weapons, from simple iron rods and police batons to purpose-built clubs with nails and other pointy bits installed on them. A June of 2020 fight in the Galwan Valley included over 600 soldiers combined and actually incurred a few deaths, though the vast majority of those came from dudes accidentally falling down the mountain. Right now, India is looking to upgrade from batons and bats with nails in them to literal electric tridents, which is pretty cool, I think. Speaking of a fun little mixture of past and present, India is the only country that still has camels in their ranks. Oh, but Justin, you're saying obviously this is just ceremonial. Oh, is that so? Check this shit out. They made technicals out of camels, and they covered them with camouflage. Can you imagine the trust it takes to strap a machine gun on an animal whose head is literally in line with the barrel? That only makes slightly more sense than the dudes with rifles just standing on them. Like, imagine this guy, chicken wing out, not even aiming, just him and his camel looking to come kill you. If there was more footage on camels in the Indian military, I promise you that's all this video would have been about. But these are actually still used as part of the Border Security Force, or BSF BSF contingent, specifically for patrolling along the India-Pakistan border. But that's not the only interesting thing that the military has to do at this border, because every day you can see men in fabulous mustaches trying to out-goose-step each other. The Atari Wagah border ceremony takes place every day between the Indian BSF and the Pakistani Rangers, and has occurred since 1959, and even that one time in 2014 when a dude blew himself up at it. Every evening, right before sunset, both flags are lowered simultaneously. The flags are then folded, and after a fun little exposition on the prowess of each country's hamstring muscles, they shake hands and the gates are closed. In 2010, it became a rule that during the handshake, both sides actually had to smile each other after a Pakistani general said that the overall ceremony was too aggressive, and that the smile would help decrease political tensions on both sides. Indian soldiers are hand-selected for this role and are required to grow a wonderful beard and, more importantly, a mustache, something seen in other Indian government offices due to it commending more respect. And goddamn it, did they nail it with that one. I've already mentioned that the Indian military is pretty darn big, but unlike every other military these days, they are not having a recruitment crisis. In less developed countries, steady jobs can be harder to come by, and like here in the States, the military in India is a solid way to get 3 hots and a cot. Up until recently, signing up with the Indian military would lock you into a 15-year contract, which, if you've ever signed on the dotted line for these United States of America, is an insane thing to do, because here we're used to 4 and 5-year contracts, and the majority of people getting out as soon as their minimum time requirement is up. This worked for quite a long time, but as it became easier to find remote international work for the young folks of India, and that whole COVID thing going on, literally no recruitment in the armed forces was done from 2019 to 2022. However, in those 3 years, nearly 200,000 troops left the service, which naturally was going to cause some personnel issues. India then enacted what they called the Agnipath scheme, which began in June of 2022. This was a totally revolutionary idea that allowed people to only sign up for 4-year commitments. Unlike here in the United States, where you can just walk into a recruiter's office pretty much any day of the week, India only accepts recruits twice a year, which is where you get these style of videos of mass groups of recruits going through the process. And if you ever wondered why they're getting super touchy-feely in really weird ways, you tend to get weird potential health issues if you grow up in the Indian countryside. It just is what it is. These new recruits under the system will be referred to as Agniveers, that translated means fire warriors, which falls in line with their love of After Effects and their official military publications. Agniveers is an entirely separate rank from the traditional ones, recruited for the longer enlistment contracts who go by sepoys. Along with a distinct rank, they're also going to have a distinct insignia on their uniform, which is a great way to put a target on their back for bitch duties and getting hazed. Funnily enough, this new form of military contract, which seemingly makes sense in every other country in the world, has taken a ton of backlash. Lots of this came from the fact that no studies were done to see if this would actually work or not, or what the potential problems would be, the fact that it was not at all discussed in any parliament hearing, and that it could lead to waves of unemployment once their contracts ended. One particular article on the new system brings up concern that people will be joining the military for the wrong reason. Primarily troops that serve just a few years are only doing it for the paycheck and not for things like honor, which is funny considering the paycheck was the only thing keeping me and most of my friends in the military in the first place. In fact, if you try to go research more of this stuff after the video, you're going to be hard-pressed to find anyone saying anything positive about it whatsoever, so honestly, I might be the first. People even started setting trains on fire because of this thing, so, you know, maybe they know something we don't. What about their military strategy? How does India plan on fighting their next war? Well, just like when I had to go hang out with my ex-wife and her mother at the same time, India is prepping for a two-front war, one against Pakistan and one against China. For both of these, they've created what they call the Cold Start Doctrine, which is a fairly simple but highly detailed, deeply planned attack. The idea is that a holding corps made up of light infantry and preset defensive positions would hold off an incoming PLA or Pakistani attack. Simultaneously, mechanized infantry organized into a strike corps would push past the holding corps, quickly grabbing territory and targets in the other nation, specifically against nuclear silos closest to the border, in order to hold them as a sort of hostage that would prevent any kind of nuclear retaliation. India denies that this doctrine exists at all because it's generally not the best thing to bring to a negotiating table in the back of your head knowing that you have plans to invade that country. However, they've literally already done it after a December of 2001 terrorist attack where the strike corps was mobilized to the Pakistani border. But its physical movement to the border went so horribly wrong and took so much time that by the time the Indian military managed to get to the border, No one actually wanted to fight the war anymore. But as India grows and gradually becomes more homogenized, we can expect their military to do the same. With a number of military advancements such as new weapon systems, improved kit, and strategic assets, this video will probably look wildly updated within the next decade. Doesn't mean you shouldn't come back and rewatch it though. And on that note, thank you for watching, please subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.